Anglo-Saxon literature. Anglo-Saxon literature was anonymous and oral. The poet, called a scope, entertained the nobleman in halls of kings, often accompanied by a harp. The scope's social function was extremely important since he sang epics celebrating cultural values on occasion of great ceremonies and festivities. Anglo-Saxon poetry was formed in a long process of collective memorization, passed by word of mouth, and from one period to the next, until, in the 12th century, it was written down by the church clerks. Poetry had two complementary modes, the epic and the elegiac. The main formal aspects of Anglo-Saxon poetry were stress and alliteration. Each line was divided into two halves by a break and had four stresses. Alliteration, that is the repetition of the same consonant sound in consecutive or closely connected words, was used to link the two halves of the line. Another important feature was the canning, a formulaic phrase used in place of a name or noun. For example, the most famous epic poem in Old English, Beowulf. In Beowulf, the sea is called the Whale Road. But during the Middle Age, the lyric became a popular form. Lyrics expressed intense personal emotions and could be sung with the accompaniment of a musical instrument. The earliest lyrics were religious in tone, but later they became secular, dealing with love and nature. Then, a new genre that emerged in the Middle Age was that of metrical romances. They were tales in verse about chivalry, love, and supernatural creatures like fairies, giants, dragons, and wizards. They came from three main sources: France, Rome, for example, classical stories such as the conquest of Troy, and Britain, such as the story of King Arthur and his knights. The greatest of all English metrical romances were Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, whose author is anonymous. Popular ballads were composed between the 13th and 14th centuries. They are known as the medieval ballads. They were anonymous and were intended for singing and dancing. The language was simple and included formulaic phrases to describe conventional settings, settings and characters. They were transmitted orally and were collected only in the Reliques of Ancient English Poetry by Bishop Thomas Percy in 1765. But the greatest medieval poet and father of English literature was Geoffrey Chaucer. He wrote the narrative poem The Canterbury Tales in the East Midland dialect, which gradually became the basis of modern English. For example, it could be remembered like our Italian Dante with La Divina Commedia. The epic poem. The word epic comes from the Greek noun epos, which means oral exposition. Later examples of epic poems are Virgil's Aeneid and the Anglo-Saxon Beowulf. The epic poem is a long narrative poetical composition which deals with the recollection of a glorious past in the national history of a country and the brave deeds of heroes. The scene is often occupied by supernatural creatures like monsters. The society described in epic poetry is aristocratic and military. There is no attempt to deal with the story of a single human being. Common people exist only in the background. They exist because they are related to heroes. The narrative of the epic poem is made up by a series of vivid pictorial flashes or scenes such as the banquet, the battle, the voyage, and the funeral. Another feature is its being an objective narration, since neither the poet nor his characters criticize the ideals and the customs of their country. The main theme is the nature of heroic life and the function of leadership in heroic society. The didactic aim is linked to the celebration of heroic values. All men should perform actions which lead to glory. The style is elevated, the vocabulary is extremely rich and vivid. Each line is divided into two halves by a break and has four stresses. Alliteration links the two halves of the line. And what about the pagan elegy? The complementary mode to epic poetry was the elegy. It is a lyrical poem, generally in the form of a dramatic monologue, where an isolated speaker expresses his loss of friendship, favor, and past splendor. The reason behind such a dramatic situation are implied but not described, and the images are active rather than static. One of the favorite themes of the elegy is the figure of the exile, which haunts the Anglo-Saxon imagination as a constant fear of a possible dissolution of the clan due to internal conflict or external attack. So the loss of a place within the community deprived the life of individual of its meaning. Outside the bounds of the clan, there was a hostile world in which even the best mind might be unable to establish new relationships. Therefore, the main character of the elegy is that one of the lone wanderer, with whom the audience can share a moving view of the human condition. The melancholic mood of the poem is conveyed through vivid and descriptive language, while the oral aspect is underlined by the frequent use of alliteration. An important example of pagan elegy is The Wanderer, which is anonymous. But let's see the medieval ballad. Ballads have been sung throughout the English-speaking world in different times and places, and they can vary both in words and tune while maintaining the same narrative outline. The ballad has no moral aim. It tells a dramatic story, not a continuous sequence of events, but a series of rapid flashes. The language is very simple. There is a mixture of dialogue and narration. Ballad narrators do not speak in the first person, and they don't comment on their reaction to the emotional content of the story. A four-line stanza is used, often rhyming A, B, C, B, and a refrain that is a repeated line or group of lines. The medieval ballad does not only provide a description of real characters, but also present a supernatural creatures like fairies, witches, and ghosts. They can be classified according to the following themes: ballad of magic, about fairies, ghosts, witchcraft, and transformation; border ballads, about the conflict, the rivalry between the English and the Scottish people; ballads of love and domestic tragedy; and ballads of outlaws, such as the cycle of Robin Hood. And finally, let's see the medieval narrative poem. A narrative poem tells a story in verse and contains narrative elements such as the setting, in time and place, the description of characters, and the use of a narrator, often in the first person. Collections of stories were very popular in the Middle Ages, and they had the purpose of entertaining and instructing. The medieval narrative poem introduced a narration showing links with the moral views of the time, as well as with the changing social structure. It provided an insight into individual characters as regarded their lifestyles, their psychology, and their experiences. As you know, the greatest example of a narrative poem in medieval literature is the Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, which is not simply a collection of tales, but a long poem framed by a general prologue and In it, each tale has meaning in relation to the character of its teller and to the other characters in the poem, who make up the audience.